It's an honor to be joining you. And again, I'm sorry we can't meet in person, but I'm learning, as many people are now, that there's great upsides to online connectedness as an alternative to being face to face. You can have a much more global audience, a much more global interchanges of ideas. So, and of course, you're limited because you can't hug each other and the like. And there's a lot of hugging is needed these days for sure. I like to start anything I do this on one of the days of this pandemic by honoring and acknowledging the sacrifice of those frontline workers and doers who, it used to be that you'd think about after 9/11, you would think about during a war, there is a front line, right? We talk about frontline workers, but with this pervasive risk, it's all around us. It's store clerks, it's hospital orderlies as much as surgeons, it's healthcare workers and nursing homes. So just a pause to honor their sacrifice and the risks that they face is appropriate. I'm going to enter presenter mode. Assume that will work. We had it worked out a little while ago. So I'm going to show you a few things to kind of lead us through some thoughts. And I think the key um, idea that has been reinforced for me with what we're experiencing now is reorienting how we think about goals. A lot of our goals and things like climate change are numerical. They're an outcome, as in contrast to your goal being to create a system with resilience and enterprise and adaptability. And where this is being enforced on us now. So that's what I'd like to talk about. And here's, hopefully you're seeing this. We're also at this other juncture, besides being in, and let me know if you're not seeing the screen as we planned. Apologies, but we're back. And we're back in 1970 when I was around, was I 13? I was born in 56. Yeah. So 1970 was the first Earth Day, the first moment when there was a youth-driven, campus-driven largely movement to clean up the place. This was after World War II. We had this huge surge of progress and industrialization that brought a chunk of the world out of poverty and brought us modernity and the Cold War and many other things. And the Vietnam War, of course, was also surging at that time. And now here we are 50 years later, two generations by the old method of measuring generations of human beings, facing a world of questions. And I like to use moments like this to think again, well, we can ponder the last 50 years. So let's throw that forward and see, is there anything we can illuminate for our pathway going forward based on what we've learned so far? There are things, of course, you cannot, the future is always not a function of the past, and that's never been more true than now. But there's plenty you can learn about how to refine how we look at the world and how we define progress and the like. And this was, I went to the demonstration at the UN. It was the first one of the Fridays for Future demonstrations after for transatlantic crossing.
We vote next.
So there's some resonance there for sure in terms of young people activated.
We vote next.
And I do love that particular chant. This is their 2070 is their world far more than mine.
We vote next. We vote next.
So my journey has been mainly in the context of being a journalist. I didn't come into this life to be a journalist. I actually was mainly interested in marine biology. I grew up in Rhode Island on the coast, and Jacques Cousteau wooed me into the sea. But I have an inquiring mind, and I also have that habit of, did you hear that? ... That's kind of like, I'm never comfortable just seeing and experiencing something without sharing it. So that's what led me into journalism. And it's taken me from the Vatican to the North Pole to the Hudson River, where I've helped scientists tag ancient, wonderful sturgeon, which are surging back after having almost been extinguished by our thirst for those fish, to demonstrations and 30 years of climate reporting. I will caution, I loved Murray Gellmann died last year. He was a great physicist who won a Nobel Prize, and he had this habit of when he looked at a complex problem like the human journey, he would say, you have to step back and take a crude look at the whole. It's fine to be quantitative, and you have to understand, the limits of the atmosphere if you're going to go into space and the like. But if you're not assessing the whole picture, you're going to fail. And as a journalist, basically, I think I've always been in that what he called claw mode, taking a crude look at the whole. So what I'm describing here is more like a foggy landscape than some clear path. And my beat has been this: it's been the human surge. In around 2015, a group of scientists published a Great Acceleration. It's easy to Google for. There's a relic website, igpp.net, that charted pretty clearly, in a way that's vivid, how we are surging. And you can see it's divided. You can see basically much of our progress surges in GDP and energy use, water use, and you could add to those things, access to education, literacy, reductions in child mortality. We've been doing great, right? But it's come at the expense of many Earth systems, and not all those curves are exponential anymore. You can see that the amount of land used, for example, is to produce the world's food is not surging as much as the world's food production is surging. That's what you want to see. You want to see what's called decoupling. You want to see human progress and development without the regress in landscapes. It's possible to do that. CO2, which has consumed much of my reporting time, is another animal. It's cumulative, right? Once you liberate that carbon, I don't know if you heard that song I wrote about liberated carbon earlier, but you take a chunk of coal out of the ground and you combust it, you end up releasing the carbon molecules and atoms and CO2 molecules, and they stay in the atmosphere for a very long time, which is why you get this surge mode in CO2. And it's a heat trapping gas, and it has an amplifying effect on the adding more water vapor and getting more warming, and it kind of keeps leading in a certain direction, which we found very troubling and hard to deal with. So here's the good news, I guess, sort of good news. I realized at a certain point, I think about population a lot, and I still do. It's still an important question, but in complex ways we won't get into today. So you could blame this all on me, right? There's my birth date, and here's the surge of us. I was born 64 years ago, last month. And basically everything that's happened in the world since then is my fault. You could kind of say that if you want to be simplistic about cause and effect. But you do know I'm a boomer. Basically, I came of age at the peak of this period of privilege and access and comfort. And now the question is, how do we move forward? How do we progress? How do we sustain and expand well-being equitably in a way that doesn't keep nudging those Earth systems toward regretful paths? Just to give you a quick view of my stuff, in 1985 was my first story on the human impact on the climate. And it was not global warming. It was the opposite. If we burned enough cities in a nuclear war, we would not only have a calamity on the ground and from the radiation, but we would be chilling the Earth dangerously. And just in the past couple of months, there have been new papers saying that even if just India and Pakistan unleashed their nuclear arsenals, that could calamitously chill the climate long enough to create significant problems for food and for some ecosystems. Along comes global warming. 1988, my first cover story. I kind of like to regard these two because they say a lot about the media as well. To grab your attention, we need to be dramatic and stark and cartoonish almost sometimes. And that headline effect, that what I call the front page thought, can sometimes drive the nuance out of what we're thinking and about issues. And that's gotten only worse in the internet age. I do entire other talks on how we move forward with the media. I was in the Amazon rainforest in 1989 to write a book about the murder of Chico Mendes, a Brazilian activist who was one of 1,000 or more people who lost their lives on the front lines of our resource frontiers in the 70s and 80s. And it was a sobering experience. And I learned a lot about the reality that basically anything we see as an environmental problem at its root is a social pressure problem. And none of this would matter, really. The environment doesn't really care what we do. It's all about how we behave and in the context of each other and what we think about resources, what you think about a landscape. And that, of course, the burning back then was much more extensive and much more violent than it is now, even with that surge last year. That was basically small scale version of what was going on back then in terms of both human violence and violence to nature. So these things, it's important not to forget those aspects of things. I saw some really bizarre and sobering vistas when I was in the Amazon. In Manaus, a city that's now several million people. I poked into a bar and there was a sloth hanging out by the soap opera, the TV showing a soap opera. And right down the street, there was a funeral parlor with coffins in all sizes. And as a Rhode Island suburbanite, who had gotten into journalism and science early, I hadn't had to confront the reality that in many parts of the world, it's almost like a Starbucks kind of scenario, small, medium, large. There's still, even though child mortality we've had huge progress with that almost entirely around the world, it's still unremarkable to think that that is part of our landscape. And that's one of the great challenges of our time still, is to create full opportunity for health. And boy, if that ever was relevant, it's now. I wrote a book in 1992 that's my first book on global warming, came out then, and it had this phrase in it where I was reflecting on where we're at, where we're going. It was a chapter on human impacts on the earth. And I kind of basically predicted the Anthropocene. There have been plenty of writers, even in the 1800s, who said we were increasingly creating a human-shaped planet or Earth system. But this evidently was the first time anyone had proposed that we had left the Holocene being the 11,700 year stretch since the last ice age ended. And I described this at the time as perhaps Earth scientists of the future will name this new post-Holocene era for its causative element. For us, we're entering an age that might someday be referred to as, and I was just making up words, Anthropocene. After all, it's a geological age of our own making. Now, again, when I said Earth scientists of the future, I was thinking, the future. Hundreds of years from now, some archaeologist or a geologist will be digging in the ground and say, "Wow, this is when it happened." And what happened was scientists just less than a decade later, proposed this formally. It came out spontaneously after Paul Crutzen stuttered at a meeting that we were no longer in the Holocene. This book was not very well read at the time. It wasn't like they had read my book and then finally solidified it. It was my book came out when the Persian Gulf War was happening. There's lots of other things going on, so it just sort of it's resurfaced. And I ended up on the Anthropocene Working Group, this group of mostly stratigraphers assessing the evidence of that there is this shift, that we have left the Holocene, and the thinking is that is a done deal. If we turned off the economy permanently now, there wouldn't be enough of a blip in the carbon and the record and the rock to probably show that we had been here. But that's still up to us to determine. And I always had, I think the environmental movement, and I've reflected this, in the 20th century, we managed environmental problems. We created laws and regulations and technologies that helped to limit pollution as we knew it at the time, that helped to preserve the endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. There was regulation and measurement and evaluation. And there was, in this book, I quoted Matthew Fontaine Maury, who was an oceanographer in the 1850s, who talked about the right-minded mariner. He was a Navy guy. It's up to any right-minded mariner, anyone crossing the sea for a purpose, should understand the workings of the machine, meaning of the Earth and Earth systems, and to manage it. So it was just like, we need to manage the Earth. Became kind of a mantra in my head, and I'll describe how that came unraveled in my own head later, and I have this different vision of how we move forward that's less managerial. So I came to this ecosystem after all that. The New York Times, I learned about the front page thought, the pull of the front page, the stresses in getting something right on a day-to-day basis. You're seeing this in spades now as journalists struggle with how to cover COVID-19. A new paper comes out on hydrochloroquine or the origins of the virus, and we all jump on it as news, and the public, the readers, are just immersed with new questions. Is that the new thing? And we haven't really figured out very well how to capture your attention while also including the nuance. So, new science is fundamentally new. It's not necessarily established facts yet. That's a challenge. I did start to learn, though, things were more nuanced than I thought, either in my early days, just as a student or as a journalist. And you often think of the "we" concept. We are taking down trees. We are deforesting the Amazon. We are adding carbon to the atmosphere. We now know. We use that word all the time. And I became increasingly cognizant of the reality. There is no "we" when it comes to these grand issues. The "we" of energy is the difference between this young woman in a soot-stained hut in India and my sister's apartment in the city with a nice gas grill. Living in New York City in a small apartment is incredibly energy efficient. It's great. Probably the best we can do in a modern society is to live in New York City in a building with all that efficiency, but it's still a profound difference between the energy needs and options of someone in the rich world and the poor world. And we have this reality, which I experienced when I went to Singapore. Some of you have probably been to Singapore, where there's this Gardens by the Bay uh, uh, botanical center that's amazing. It's, I think, the largest glass enclosed botanical garden in the world. And I suddenly realized one of the facilities there was one of the chambers, one of the rooms was Europe, essentially. It was a Mediterranean climate. So here we are, 80 miles from the equator, and you could be in a Mediterranean climate. And that struck me as a powerful signal of, if you have wealth and technology, you can pretty much sail through a lot of what's coming because you can seal yourself off from the ultra humid landscape outside. And I spent time in Kibera and Matari, two slums in Nairobi in 2000, that same year, burning a lot of carbon. Yep. And I met shack dwellers there who have none of that insulation between them and the climate system, between them and the biological system. And one of my great fears right now is that as this virus spreads, it's just really touched down in Africa. And friends who are journalists in various parts of Africa have been sketching out via WhatsApp what's going on. It's just the beginning stages of a calamity there, the likes of which we haven't experienced anything like what's going to be coming in the global south in the next few months. So it's the world's responsibility to get at that really quickly. So I created a blog at the Times, which I think hopefully represents more and more of how we can all communicate, whether you call it a blog or not. In 2007, no one said, "Hey, Andy, we need a sustainability blog." It just felt like a better way to capture the full dimensionality of the challenges around us. Climate is not just a climate story. It's everything. It's poverty, it's energy access, it's energy technology, it's innovation questions, it's regulatory, it's behavioral. It's got all those elements, and all this, everything I kept writing had this sort of prismatic quality to it. So the blog felt like a good way to get at that. And as you can see right there, 2011, and here we are, I think, in the middle of this question in a bigger way. Can the human race shift from sprint to marathon? And we had been, if you think back to those great acceleration curves, in a sprint. And now something different is hopefully emerging as we come out of this terrible devastation, which is teaching us some grand lessons. And I learned about other complexities of the human journey, many of which are internal, that we don't all see the world the same way, that we don't all look at the same facts with the same process, that our culture can powerfully shape how we receive or reject information. And there's a field called cultural cognition. You can see the URL there. That's Dan Kahan, Kahan, at Yale, at the law school, has done rigorous, a couple of decades of work that illustrate that, for example, these are all Nobel Prize winning physicists, and they had very different interpretations of climate, ranging from dismissive to deeply concerned, and very different views of what you do about it. And some of Dan Kahan's work shows that your basic literacy in physics and science is not an indicator of concern about global warming. So this is a reflection of that. So as a journalist, that was like an existential gut punch. That the idea that, well, if I just keep putting out really cool stories about global warming, people will then all get into concern mode. It just doesn't work. And I wrote about An Inconvenient Truth when it came out. And after I learned about this body of science, I thought that maybe we would do better with a sequel being called An Inconvenient Mind, because that's a big chunk. And think about how we're responding to the virus. Think about people who are out there burning down telecom towers because they think 5G is somehow involved with driving the virus. Think about the fights over chloroquine. Think about the way our president treats information, and you realize, and how people respond to that, and you realize this isn't just about information and education. So a key part of my blog was this: we are in a race between our potency, our awareness of our potency in the world, and what the risks we can generate, but also our awareness of ourselves, self-awareness, and resilience as well. This was when we were sketching out the blog, like, what should .earth be about? And I still put these questions in the foreground every day. And here's where the management idea really left me. 2015, the Pope came to New York City, and this was when the drive was on to push the development goals over the finish line, the 17 goals that replaced the Millennium Development Goals from a decade earlier. And I kept thinking about those goals. I wrote one piece on .earth that was, do the rich countries need new goals as well? That was back in 10 years earlier. And I was saying the top billion need goals as well. And I think that's part of what we're all grappling with and searching for going forward. So I was at a meeting. I ran a panel at this meeting in New York City that week when the Pope was in town. And a guy named Heriberto Cabezas, who's a sort of a mathematics-driven statistics guy, gave a presentation on sustainability, like grand scale modeling of sustainability. How do we get through the next 200 years? It was really fascinating. His conclusions kind of blew me away. And you don't have to read all of these. This will be archived, of course. The last line is the one that was impressive to me. Coordinated manipulation of at least 6 variables is necessary to maintain stability for 200 years or so. And as he's saying these words, my brain was really resisting. I was kind of like, wow, that just didn't feel like what the world looked like. Coordinated manipulation of at least 6 variables is necessary to maintain stability for 200 years or so. And I asked him, I raised my hand like a kid, a high school kid, or more like a 6th grader, and I said, that just doesn't sound like the world I know. And this is what he said: we lack a cultural narrative that says sustainability is really important. We have a cultural narrative that says murder is wrong. We don't have a cultural narrative that says managing our planet in the way that allows us to live on it as long as we can is probably the most important thing. And yeah, he's right. It's a question of ethics. It's a question of a narrative. So far, that's not really ingrained in how we think. And that's not even the worst of it. I'm sad. I'm going to take you up from here. I'm taking you down so far, I think. But there's an upside to what's going on. When I was writing about the tsunami, I wrote a lot about earthquakes, right? Starting from 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami, right through, recently. And when the terrible quake shook Japan and generated that tsunami, I, like many of you, learned the story of these tsunami stones that were in many villages along that coast that was devastated by the waves. And this was what the warning is: high dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point. And of course, we forgot. Not just there's the we all forget. With the pandemic, my friend Laurie Garrett, since the 80s, has been writing the same story over and over and over again about the growing risk from pathogens that can leap species and get through our networks and create calamity. And here we are, kaboom. And so that leads me to this question, which, as you see here, in 2008, a reader posted this as a comment on my .earth blog: are we stuck with blah, 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 bang? And I've reposted or published that same line, I don't know, half a dozen times since then, because it does still feel like an open question. And, I did my own little bit of writing on pandemic risk, but most of it was because I didn't really, because other reporters were doing the great work on that. Don McNeil here. These are pieces in 2008, 2009, where I did get at this idea that we have one health on this planet, and we have to figure out ways to integrate that into how we build and forward for sure. So here's a couple more points. In 2018, I gave a talk to some journalists from around Latin America in Costa Rica on how to think about Zika, which at that time was just receding from having been this huge story. And I was preparing for that. And one of the slides I showed was this one. This is in 2018. There was a World Health Organization annual review of list of priority diseases for research. And the one that struck me at the time was disease X. Disease X represents the knowledge that a serious international epidemic could be caused by a pathogen currently unknown to cause human disease. And so that's 2018, and kaboom, here's 2020. And here is the timeline. This emerged in November, December. Laurie Garrett was tweeting about it in January in a big way. And this past week, they had the first deaths in Amazonia, deep in the Amazon. The Yanomami Indians, they're starting to drop from the coronavirus that started its existence in a novel way in the human species just a few months ago. So you can get totally overwhelmed by this, or you can start to think, how do we move forward? How do we build forward from here? How do we do two things at once? Help our neighbors as much as we can, help ourselves as much as we can, and make sure we don't take these trillions that are going to pour in and simply rebuild the same systems over again. So this gets me back to this notion of moving from a managerial approach, top-down, mechanistic, to something different. So numbers are not as relevant. I'm going to fast forward here because I want to make sure we have time for a couple questions. In 2013, I crystallized this without realizing it in a couple of tweets. I woke up one morning and said, well, what would be the characteristics of a system? What would be the characteristics of a community, of a family, of a world that give me confidence, anyone confidence that it can handle the characteristics of the world today better? It can be more resilient, more empathic, more participatory, more inclusive. What would that look like? And I just rattled off words: bend, stretch, reach, teach, reveal, reflect, rejoice, repeat. Those are the things that you would need more of, or better versions of, to move forward. And I started to just dig in more and more on that. And maybe it's because I'm also a songwriter. I don't do rap or anything, so I'm not going to do that for you. But bend, stretch, reach, teach, reveal, reflect, rejoice, repeat. I'm going to go really quickly because I want to be sure we have time. Bend is kind of, you think about resilience, you're thinking about bendiness, like bamboo in the wind. But it's like how you live your life. Billy Parrish, there with the bare feet, in 2005, I met him in Montreal at the climate talks. And he was a firebrand student organizer and energetic, in-your-face demonstrator, and trying to get the diplomats in gray suits to do better. And now he went on to become in the finance world. He built a company, Mosaic, that helps to finance solar installations on rooftops and on low-income housing and the like. So he shifted. He found a way to keep out his goal, but using a plasticity in his own life. And I'll get back to that in a minute. Here, Susie Moser, over on the left in that picture, she spoke at this managed retreat meeting we did at Columbia last year on sea level rise. And she has this whole project built around the idea of the adaptive mind. And I hope if you write down one thing from this talk, just scribble down the words adaptive mind and Google for that. As she says here, her goal is to facilitate, as a social scientist, our capacity to have traits, characteristics that can lead to more ability to get through these tough moments. She calls it a set of propensities, leadership skills, capacities that allow an individual embedded in social networks and institutions to respond with agility, creativity, resolve, and resilience. And resilience to what? Constant change, including surprises, rapid shifts, pervasive uncertainty, and not knowing, anticipatory, vicarious, and/or direct traumatic experiences in change, and challenges associated with deep, systemic, and transformative change. Think about the nature of the world right now. Think about where we're at, and think about that, and then step back and say, well, what is it that my university could do to forge more of that? What is it my own household could do to think about how to incorporate those ideas? how can we take our existing skill sets and make sure that the right tool and the right job, if it's over there, can connect with someone over here? What does that look like? And to me, it looks like bend, stretch, reach, teach, reveal, rejoice, reflect, repeat. And I've seen it in spades right around us in these last few weeks. I started this thing called Sustain What 4 weeks ago on a Sunday, March 15th. As it's a video webcast. You can just Google for Sustain What to find it. And I, through a contact at Columbia, I learned that in Bhopal, India, there's a cluster of private citizens who had formed. Initially, they knew each other because they're involved in a plastic waste reduction project in Bhopal, and now they formed a food collaborative, food collective and dispensary to get the poorest people who are in lockdown to not starve as India goes through this transformative and catastrophic moment. Right at Johns Hopkins, you've had this great example in January where Lauren Gardner and Ensheng Dong had this thought right at the very beginning in January, wow, how are we going to maintain some understanding of what's going on here? And they literally overnight developed the bare bones of this tool that you've heard just a few minutes ago has become a vital hub for the world. A couple billion people have visited this. And it was because they're in engineering, but they were thinking about the crisis now and thinking, what skills and tools can we bring to this? In 2009 in Istanbul, I was reporting on the future earthquake risk there, and I found that these small Swiss nonprofit group had trained about 100 teams across the city to become search and rescue teams. And that was very cool because when a mega city gets turned into 100 little cities after a big earthquake, and it's coming, right? Like many places are facing the same kind of threat. But what was interesting to me was when I interviewed this one group, it turned out that they had responded to a bombing that had taken down a building. Even though they were trained about earthquakes, they had this plasticity, the ability to say, oh, wow, we can still do this. And that's the kind of capacity I think that's really needed now. Bend, stretch is stretching our minds. The failure of the imagination was a key to failure to understand what was coming at us these last few months. If you go on my Sustain What series, you'll see several conversations I had with intelligence officials who just said this was a total failure of imagination, just as we failed to anticipate adequately 9/11. And you have to stretch to fill in the blanks to think about the future, getting out of the moment at least enough now to think, what do we want? This was the great Mannahatta project that Sanderson and others at Wildlife Conservation Society did an ecological footprint for New York going back to 1609. And now we know, of course, 2009, as you could see in that picture. And now, so what's 2,409? Or in my case here, what's 2070? You can build forward right now, depending on how you look at landscapes and how you build for resilience. I'm going to go fast because I don't want to run out of time. The connectedness that's putting us in touch right now, even though we're all distributed around the country or the world, is something that is flooding us with all kinds of crap half the time. But it can be a powerful tool for getting knowledge where it's needed, for building cohesion at a distance. There's ways to do this. And this is just one example, Digital Green. If you search for Digital Green, you'll find out about a YouTube and video network across India and now increasingly Africa that's allowing farmers to share their own insights with each other. Stretching is stretching out of your own mental pathways. We're all path dependent. We're based on our education, our culture. And Randy Olson, a friend of mine who's doing free online trainings on storytelling right now, he's down at the bottom there, ABT agenda. He's always encouraged people to get out of the nerd loop being kind of what we're doing right now, meaning talking to each other about how to communicate better to forge a better world. And being more experimental. I will say that Sustain What, this video thing I just started, is an experiment and it's working. It looks like we'll have a partnership with National Geographic, and it didn't exist a month and a half ago. So test the limits of technology. See if you could use a fork the way you'd use a spoon if you don't have a spoon. There must be a way, right? So look around you. The hashtag is your friend. Twitter is your friend. It feels sometimes overwhelming. You can tame it. The hashtag was invented in 2007 by Chris Messina. He was at Mozilla, that internet company. And he just said, hey, can we use the pound sign and a name to like how to have a conversation amid all this noise? And sure enough, it's become a very useful tool. There's tons of noise, and this allows you to create a signal in the noise. One of my favorites is Skype a Scientist, which has, by the way, they're booming right now because it's all about how do you get scientists into classrooms. Well, you put up, the hashtag is basically raising your hand for teachers and students to find you. So teaching, yeah, here we go, the new classroom. Sarah McNulty was a marine biologist at University of Connecticut. She really launched Skype a Scientist. I did a video interview with her recently. Wonderful innovation. YouthRemoteLearning.com, which is a place to trade to become a teacher in this time when we're all at home. And if you have skills, even if you're retired, you can teach kids. It was created almost overnight by Seamus Khan, who's the chairman of the sociology department at Columbia. He's got tenure. He could do whatever he wants. He could sit and write books and do his high-level courses, but he jumped right into the internet 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, and built this website, YouthRemoteLearning.com, with some others. And he's teaching a course in how to be an ethnographer. He's teaching kids right now how to chronicle the momentous historic moment around them in ways that will matter for the future. Fantastic. Ultimately, we'll get back into physical classrooms. The best model I know of is the boiler room tour. Getting any cool school in the country, yours or mine or the one down the street, can look at the school as a system. And that's a great shift from just sitting in a classroom learning about energy. And we all need to go to risk school. I wrote an article about this article in Nature way back in 2009. I did a piece on .earth about it because we are so far from really integrating, especially on these big, low probability, big bad outcome events. We just don't get it right yet. So risk school is something we can all benefit from. I mentioned, one of the great upsides to where we're at in the world right now is observing, the capacity to observe and reveal things. This is a sunny day in Colorado, and there's that same tank using a infrared wavelength. I wrote about this way back in 2009 in the New York Times, and then the Times, I think a year or so ago, did a much bigger story about how you can reveal leakage of methane and other volatile gases using infrared photography. That if you want to tell that story and you're not doing that, then you're missing the story. We have all this ability on our campuses right now. The West Virginia, the Volkswagen scandal, which is actually feeling like ancient history now, was revealed by a tiny laboratory at West Virginia University. They had a little grant to study emissions in cars, and they kept thinking their computer was wrong when they were testing these Volkswagens, and it was the Volkswagen's computer that was cheating. And so think about that campus possibility. How much of what we do in academia can have that little bit more applicability in the world around us, and you realize there's a huge potential there. Reflect is just sitting back, stepping back, saying, am I on the right path? What is the right path? Am I talking to the right people? Am I in the right discipline? And right now, I've seen wonderful examples in the last few weeks of conversations erupting. There's ecological economics. Young scholars are finding themselves via the internet, via human relationships, and I had them on my Sustain What webcast just twice now with Herman Daly, the father of ecological economics. They're all distributed in space. They're not very empowered in their universities, but they can build that power base right by themselves. There are these ways to have more reflective conversations. Peter Coleman at Columbia runs a difficult conversations laboratory, which I think is the most needed tool maybe on the planet. And this technique is being adopted in rural climate dialogues out west. And U.S. Geological Survey has this entity up in the Rockies where scientists hash out their differences. In that case, face to face. That's hard to do sometimes digitally. Mundane science. I'm not going to spend time on this. Just Google for that, mundane science, and you'll see what it's about. It's about what President Bollinger at Columbia calls the fourth purpose. How can we torque our scholarship and our learning to have broader meaning and impact in the world around us? And this has never been more important than right now. And rejoice is one of the words on my list. That was my young son, a long time ago. He's now 22 and poised, if he can get a chance after this economy re-ravels, he can pursue his vision in film and TV. and repeat is, it's probably the most important point in my little mantra. And here's Bill McKibben, who's best known for all of his activism and urgency in his writing and thinking and doing. And what I am impressed with about him is his endurance. I encourage people to look at his life, the way he has lived his life, getting up every morning and doing it a little bit more. Just like when he wrote this book, it's probably his least famous book, is about a year he spent training to do long distance skiing. We have to have that endurance to get at these grand challenges. This is not a quick hit kind of a process we're in. So at Columbia, I'm doing something that I think can spill over into other universities. It's an initiative on communication and sustainability, and we don't know the meaning. The first thing is to say sustain what, right? It's not. That's why sustain what is the question. Where do you go? Has first to start with what do you want? We're building a network that crosses disciplines. We're working with artists like Maya Lin there to help her build a richer version of her What Is Missing enterprise online. I'm creating these conversations with artists and the like online. It's a very fine line. You might have heard that song playing in that mix at the beginning. It's a song I wrote a long time ago. So in all these instances, it's these little fragmentary moments when you individually, or you and your community, or you and your classmates, or you and your students can move in one direction or another toward having a wider impact in the world, or toward just doing the learning in front of you. I think it's a daily ritual, really, to try to see if there's a little tweak you could do to get the directionality a little better. And I wanted to end with a little comment from my friend Irene Oh on one of my first sessions on this sustain what project of mine. Let's see if this works.
We've gotten a whole lot of negative press, understandably, because there are all kinds of disruptions and there were all kinds of, but as human beings, there is so much to treasure in what we do. And I looked at, we're all kind of checking these headlines and going, ooh, recession, ooh, depression, oh, what is it? And I want to put out there a new definition of what this time period is. And instead of referring to it as the Great Depression or I think this is the period of the Great Compassion.
Ooh, I like that. Wow.
Because the thing that is already opening up in it is a flood of compassion, the likes of which the human race has never seen, because we've never been quite this connected before. And as we witness, we're going to witness suffering. Yes, we're already witnessing suffering, but we are going to witness the very most powerful response from human beings, because nobody wants this. And it's all over the world. We are realizing we have to respond with compassion. And so I really do have great hopes for this. I was thinking this the other day, I was thinking, good Lord, I'm looking around, it's like everything is melting. I mean, all of our systems are melting, whether it's business or school or whatever. And so I thought, well, all right, what's that? And I'm a poet, so of course I think in metaphor. And I went, well, it was only a couple of years ago in my work as an educator that I discovered that when a caterpillar goes into the chrysalis, first of all, the caterpillars, the larvae, consume, right? We're all familiar with that. So goes into the chrysalis and actually turns liquid. Mm-hmm. The caterpillar dissolves, it becomes liquid. All the parts for the butterfly are floating around in there, but it's still liquid for us at this juncture. But I honestly believe that what will arise in the human race will be something much more winged in consciousness. And I'm, it's tough. We have to go through this, but we will. I think compassion will bring us all the way through.
Yeah, and I hope it will. I can't guarantee it. Every day we're facing this challenge of both internally and externally having that tip the balance toward compassion, toward inclusion, toward positivity. So that's the task of our time. And thanks to the scientists who created the Cassini satellite, which took this image of us from a distance, I think that's a great place to stop. And here's my stuff. And I'm all yours for some questions if we have a little time. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. We can all picture thunderous applause. And I see some. Great. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. And so I'm going to jump right into what's come in the chat box so we can get to as many as we can. And the first one comes from Stephen Blaze. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, Stephen, who's an arborist and horticulturalist, and is also a student of urban and peri-urban forest systems. And he notes that he also has a background in agriculture as well as training in mindfulness. And he asks a question. Here's an easy one for you, Andy. All right, which the question is whether a material and capitalistic approach can trigger change towards sustainable culture, or must it be paradigm shifting transformative experience that, or trauma, can offer inroads to transforming a relationship to our habits and relationship to self and environment.
Oh boy.
Basically, can this be done? You got it? Okay.
Yeah, the easy cop out is to say it's a mixture. I think the thing that resonates most with me when I hear that question is back in 2005, I wrote a story for the New York Times on what's called gross national happiness. It's the Bhutanese kingdom at the time, which was turning into a democracy, had created a new mandate for how to measure progress in Bhutan. It had 4 pillars: social, cultural, environmental, and history, culture. No, I said that. Well, anyway, you get the idea. And the question is, how do you measure it? And when I was writing that piece, I stumbled into a lot of literature research on happiness, on what makes people comfortable with their lives. And it turns out that there's a threshold pretty universally when you do like a standard income approach that essentially through the first, from total deprivation to like having the basics you need for life in any culture, that more money matters. Like money matters. This is actually gets at that. This is supports the idea for a universal basic income. That then you really do need the thing, the food, the energy, whatever. And then after that, you get on what's called a hedonic treadmill, where your sense of your sense of achievement, your sense of value is more relative. Like how it's the how am I doing compared to the Joneses? That's the classic way. So there's absolutely a need to build economies that can provide the basics. And then the question is, how do we include or shape what we're looking for? This gets back to what I was saying earlier about what your goals are, that can reflect that broader sense of what wellness is and well-being is. So there, I think you need both. And we're never going to not have I think the idea of we're going to end up with a non-monetary economy feels unrealistic. We can't just trade. I can't trade the buttons that I make for the shoes that you make. So money will be there forever, or something like it. And it's a mixture. You're silenced.
Thank you. Terrible moderation there.
That's okay.
Tom Burke asks, we are all watching the frustrations of Tony Fauci as the Lone Ranger of science. Can you give us your top recommendation for beginning to break down the science denial barriers?
God. Well, there are 2 sessions I did on my webcast, 3 with journalists talking about where do we go with journalism here? And I think Jay Rosen at New York University, who's a longtime media analyst and critic, was saying that we're in a media emergency. He's making the point to the major media, New York Times, CNN, Fox, of course, they're not going to listen, that we're in a civic emergency in which the tools in which we communicate have been co-opted, in which it's possible to have parallel, completely isolated communication channels now that can create dangerous conditions for more than that community. It's all, libertarianism and all that's fine if you're not harming other people. But with social distancing, this becomes a real issue. What I have seen, so it's not like, but the president is the president, so you can't like just turn him off, but you can shift the way you cover him so that it's not this kind of constant loop of President Trump says something totally wrong and now we're correcting it, and he says something wrong and now we're correcting it. That model can be shifted. It's not easy, but it has to be. Other things have to be tested, and you can't assume that the world is suddenly ever going to become rational. It's actually rational to be irrational. When you look at that cultural cognition work that I described, evolutionarily, just anyone quickly, if we have time, think back to the idea of you're on the Serengeti, 100,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, when our species is kind of coming together. And you went on walkabout and you saw something profound that made you realize that the norms of your tribe were didn't match what you were experiencing in the world. Do you go back to the fire and say, hey, you're all wrong? Is that adaptive? Is that smart? Probably not. In fact, the smarter you are, the less likely you would be to just run back and say, hey, we're all wrong. You think so? So that's, it's rational to be irrational sometimes. It's rational to put your culture and your tribe ahead of your sense of the world. And unfortunately, that's led us into some pretty tough places right now.
All right, thank you. Next question for you from Lauren Palais, which is, technology is often imagined as the antithesis of experiencing nature. How is this changing with the advent of coronavirus? Are we able to integrate nature with environmental education, discovering new ways to become eco-literate?
Oh, this is obviously a huge issue right now. The examples I'm familiar with, I wrote about this on .earth years ago when there was this whole turn off your phone movement. Make sure kids get off their phones and get out in the woods. Yeah, absolutely. But then I had direct experience and learned of others' experiences where a kid who is a native user of this can go into the woods and make a film now. And it's that. So the experience of nature and then sharing that story is so utterly human, right? And in the old days, it would have been writing a story, writing a report for school, maybe taking a photograph. And now, like when my younger son, when he was around 11, we were in Florida visiting my grandparents, and we went rowing down a little channel right in the middle of suburban Florida, not a lot of pretty stuff around. And there were herons nesting there, and there were baby herons. And so we decided to go back the next morning, and he shot a little video at age 11 and shared it. We shared it on YouTube, and it's got thousands of views. And you could see his excitement. He was conveying his excitement. He was being like David Attenborough, oh, there's the crested heron baby. But it was this 11-year-old kid doing it. And I think that hybrid experience can be powerful. And actually, I don't know whether that helped make him who he is now, but he's a filmmaker now. So, or at least a 22-year-old aspiring filmmaker. And then a woman told me about her story on my blog. She handed her daughter, a toddler, her iPhone. This is years ago, but this could happen now. While she was cooking dinner, so the toddler would just play with the Angry Birds or something. And the girl went out in the backyard and made a documentary also. She just started filming the backyard, and here's our prickly bush, doing her version of Margaret Mead or whatever. And so we have that capacity. And then sharing it, iNaturalist is a way, everyone lives somewhere. Even now you can go outside and walk down the sidewalk in a city or go to the park. You can still do this stuff with care, and you can start to build that bigger conversation. So it's the hybrid approach is the thing.
Thank you. Next question comes from Jenny Cox, and she notes that there are articles and talks arguing that eliminating or at least dramatically decreasing our consumption of meat and animal products would help the environment more so than anything else. Would you agree with this? Or have you seen any evidence that supports or refutes that notion in your experience?
Well, I wrote quite a bit, years ago about the concept of manufactured meat, not synthetic. It's actual. If you can start growing meat in culture, I had this vision in my head that if you want to do the perfect test case for this is way before Beyond Burgers and stuff, would be to do foie gras, which is this delicacy. People pay huge amounts of money for. It's fatty liver from ducks and geese, and it's produced in a horrible way by overfeeding the animals. And I know from my science reporting from long ago on organ transplants that liver is an incredibly proliferative tissue. Liver grows more easily in cell culture than anything. And so I thought, well, let's do foie gras, whatever you want to call it. Then you can have the wonders of that buttery kind of meat, umami madness, and not kill animals. And so slaughter-free meat now is becoming a big thing. You know, there's the artificial ones that are vegetable products, and there's actual meat is becoming a thing. And so then that changes the whole landscape of the question. So if your concern is animal ethics, you can have your meat and not slaughter. In fact, it was PETA that put out $1 million bounty for the first factory meat. And PETA, the people for the ethical treatment of animals. If your concern is climate, the same thing. If you are careful about inputs and outputs, you can create meat, using sunshine and basic ingredients. So going forward, it's not a meat or no meat question. It's an impacts question. And whether the impact is ethical or on landscapes, you can make your judgments based on the impacts. Same thing with GMOs. I'm not anti-GMO. I'm anti-bad impacts on people's health or on landscapes. And actually intensified agriculture can play a role in saving forests. That's been a clear cut. That's been a clear finding for a long time. In fact, I mentioned that data earlier. We're having peak farmland partially because you're making more stuff on less land.
Great. We have time for a couple more. So question from Kellogg Schwab, which is, first of all, thank you for the great talk. And then asking you, what do you think academics should do if they have limited bandwidth to make the greatest impact?
The limited bandwidth question is real. My wife, for K through 12, my wife teaches teachers how to incorporate sustainability concepts into their lesson plans without burdening them with bigger obligations. And whether you're in an elementary or secondary school or in university, you still have to get the stuff done, right? And this is where I think the key there is for universities to really get serious about changing incentives for how faculty are rewarded for tenure. This is starting to happen. It's really hard. It's generational. The tenure structure is never going to just go away in a blink. And maybe the nudge we're having right now, maybe, maybe as Irene Oh said, if we think of this moment in a different way, I'm hoping that people don't think of what's happening now with our online learning or convening as being a patch. This is like some fix that we're going to do. It's totally negative, and then we'll go back to the old way of doing things. That ain't going to happen. Because which of the students watching this broadcast right now, who's going to be willing to go into deep debt or spend tens of thousands of dollars to go to a school physically to learn things that you can learn online more efficiently, especially now facing a collapsed job market? So anyone thinking this is a return, we're not rebuilding. If we just rebuild from here, we're in trouble. So thinking about what's the best of what we're doing online, what are the efficiencies, what are the, not just efficiencies, but what are the actual enhancements to learning that are happening because we're online? Like think about, I was connecting with people in Bhopal in real time who are on the ground innovating around how do you feed poor people in a hurry facing a lockdown. And why any teacher can't fit that experiential capacity into learning right now without it being a compromise would be a mystery to me. It's totally doable. I mean, right now, literally, I could log in right now and get someone on the line in Botswana. And that has to be part of how we think forward here.
Great, thank you. So we're out of time. There are a few questions coming in through different platforms relating to COVID, sustainability, capitalism. So I'm going to take moderator's privilege and summarize those the way that I want to, which is you noted the marathon versus the sprint, right?
Yeah.
And right now we're seeing so many efforts to tie the response to COVID-19 and our longer term sustainability challenges. I wonder if you could speak to the opportunities and maybe challenges in that analogy, right? In responding to this crisis and in responding to the unfolding crises associated with climate change and other sustainability issues. What do you think we're getting right or wrong in tying those two?
I think the thing to focus on, that the moment here, the urgency of this moment, it probably hasn't fully percolated into society yet. How epic this is. I wake up every morning feeling like, oh, I hope this, will reopen and blah, blah, blah. And it will go back to X, Y, and Z. And this is not like that. This is way bigger than 9/11. This is way bigger than anything that's happened in our modern experience, except for those among us who are old enough to remember the polio epidemic. And those of us who are older, like Herman Daly was describing being a polio survivor when we were talking to him, or World War II or the Depression. This is like a little bit of all of those things at once. So anyone who's saying, oh, we still need to put climate in the foreground, here I am, I spent 35 years putting climate in the foreground, and I'm saying, no, right now it's in the background. Luckily, you can reduce climate impacts on people right now without worrying. The decarbonization challenge is epic, right? Getting the CO2 out of our energy system is still epic, even though we would like to do it in 10 years. It's not going to happen. And yes, there'll be these compromises, thinking, well, if they're going to spend $2 trillion right now, we got to get in there incentives for solar, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, maybe so. But even Nate Hagens on one of my talks recently, he runs the Post-Carbon Institute, right? He's all about a new world without carbon in it. And he said, we face two emergencies here, and they have to be handled in sequence. He said, Republicans have to understand we need to help poor people get jobs, and Democrats need to understand we actually have to help companies stay alive. This is Nate Hagen saying this, who's like, the ultimate Birkenstock wearing climate guy. And that's that. So I'm pretty rigorous in saying, don't, like the people in Bhopal who put aside their plastic reduction and they're using their skills as much as they can. Their existing network, like 350 right now, can be all about this. Like anyone who's networked in any capacity can dive in on this. And then you're building credibility for what you do. Then you're showing that you're communitarian, that you're showing that you're part of the bigger conversation, that you're not some niche, specialized, special interest. So take those skills and move them into the space. Don't think like competing with it.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. I apologize to those whose questions we weren't able to get to, but hopefully the breadth of this talk has inspired discussions that will go on for the rest of the day.
I'm easy to reach. They can tweet the questions to me at Revkin, or I can do a follow-up webcast on my thing with your network too. We can do that.
Great. Thank you, Andy. And again, inspiring in your energy and availability across these platforms, as well as in the knowledge you bring.